Dropping out was probably the best thing I could have done. I mean, obviously very challenging in the moment. And I actually remember I didn't even frame it to myself as dropping out because that felt too much like failing. And at that point, I wasn't yet on the bandwagon of how good failure was. So instead, I took a break. And so I said, okay, I'll just put this on pause. And I didn't know what to do. But I'm a scientist. And so classic scientist, I was like, well, I'll do an experiment. 2, 3, 4.
Yeah. Hey, baby.
Hi.
This was a lovely episode.
This was a great one, guys. We talked with Kathryn Zealand. She works at X, which is
Cool.
Alphabet's moonshot factory. She tells us what a moonshot is, how they come up with the ideas, what their experimentation process is like, what segment of moonshots end up making it to the end, and some of the cool technology that she's working on that's 10 years out. So great nuggets here.
Enjoy.
Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, Jen.
It's so good. I miss you a lot. I miss your puppies. You still have Isla, but you don't have the puppies, right?
Exactly. We just have the mum dog who was being totally quiet during the sound check and has now just decided to bark a little bit. But
she's just telling us she's here and she's supporting and she's with us.
Exactly. She's saying hi to you as well.
All right. So we're here to chat about some of your work at X and to whatever extent you can share, understanding that you're speaking as an individual, and then also learning about how you got to X, which is also a very fun story. So let me set the scene for folks who are not as familiar with what X is. So it's Alphabet's innovation lab, and we've all used products that have come out of X. So we have Google Brain, which has now been implemented in products like Google Search and Translate. We have Gcam that's used in Google Pixel phones, I believe Google Maps. And then we've heard of companies as well like Waymo, self-driving cars. It's logged over 10 million miles. We've heard of Loom, which provides internet for communities in Africa and South America with these internet balloons. So we've heard of X, amazing work. I want to ask you, though, to share with us, what is X mission? What is X looking to do?
Yeah, that's a great intro. X is Alphabet's moonshot factory. And so, when we think about the transformative effect that Google and YouTube and similar kind of technology products have had on the world, Alphabet sort of has been riding that wave. And then they said, okay, but we actually want to also be looking ahead and saying, what's the next thing? It's like, what is the next kind of technology, the next really breakthrough idea that could have such a world-changing effect on the scale of Google search? And so that was the mission that X started with. And there, you've mentioned many of them. There are a few kind of high-profile examples, something like Waymo. And I think in our early days there was a lot of just, what is a couple of big bets? Like, what are the big ideas that could be moonshots? And I think what I found really interesting is over the last 10 years, we've tried to almost more come up with a process and a factory which makes this kind of innovation repeatable, right? So it's not just about finding one more big, exciting idea, but it's how do we build an organization which can repeatedly do cutting-edge innovation again and again and again, particularly given many of these things are hard to measure, because X thinks about success as being one moonshot a decade, right? So that means we want something like Google every 10 years. And we expect along the way moderate successes where it's a good idea, but it maybe doesn't quite reach that scale. And then also a lot of bad ideas, right? Like, you're not going to get to that kind of real breakthrough without exploring lots of things that don't work first. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, given it's so difficult to measure a once a decade outcome, how do we also make this more of a process? Like, how do we set up, a repeatable approach and a philosophy around innovation, which has a good chance at coming up with multiple of these ideas over the next few decades?
Love it. And you mentioned getting to a Google type idea once a decade. You also mentioned moonshots. Help me understand what qualifies as a moonshot idea.
We normally think of a moonshot as having three components. So one is it's solving a huge problem in the world. So for something like Waymo, we might think about traffic accidents, road injuries are a really high cause of death in many parts of the world. I work on a project now where the huge problem that we think about is human movement, right? So especially as people are getting older, but also after an injury, people are struggling to move about, and that can really affect your quality of life. I think about that as often my grandmother, who really wanted to stay part of her community, but when she was struggling to walk just the mile from her house into the center of town, then she struggled to go to church, she struggled to do her own shopping. And so human movement, and especially the lack of movement, is something which is a huge problem that affects many people. So those are examples of huge problem is kind of the first component. The second component we think of a moonshot is being enabled by some breakthrough technology, right? So what is different about the world, now that means that we could solve this problem that many years ago we couldn't. So again, sticking with the mobility example and thinking about movement, robotics have come a long way. And so, 10, 20 years ago, when people thought about how do we physically assist movement, you had these really heavy, clunky robots. Like, that's not going to be the kind of thing that my mother or my grandmother could wear. But nowadays, we have really lightweight batteries, we have lightweight motors. We can integrate these technologies much more seamlessly with sensors and with our movement. And so, especially advances in computation, in sensing, in robotics are kind of some of the breakthrough technology that might enable a moonshot. So number 2 is kind of breakthrough technology. And then the third component is some sort of radical idea or radical solution, or really just like taking the technology and apply it to the problem. And often these will start as questions, right? So like, oh, would it be possible for, your clothing to be more intelligent? Is it possible for cars to drive themselves? What if we could predict the weather? So it's sort of an articulation of almost a future state or kind of a radical idea that is ideally solving the problem and enabled by this technology. So those are the 3 pillars that we'd associate with a potential moonshot.
Yeah, makes sense. You mentioned this mobility idea with the elderly. It's a big space these days. I know about your grandma, and I know that that's really personal to you. And then self-driving cars. Hey, we have Waymo now. We have lots of other companies working in the space. So really meaningful work. I am so fascinated by your brainstorming process, the fact that you really create a space where folks can come in with whatever idea they're personally interested in and throw it out there, and trying to limit what the constraints are, allowing the development and exploration of those ideas. Can you tell me more about what that brainstorming process is like, and how you then select what ideas to initially go pre-mortem on?
Yeah. We talk about sort of stage appropriate idea generation and risk appetites. And so X is kind of broken down into, the first team is called rapid evaluation. So they're probably what you're thinking of, like a small group of people brainstorm crazy ideas, look at things very briefly. And I actually started in that team at X.
Right.
And then just for completeness, kind of there's early pipeline, early stage projects, and then X projects we typically think about as slightly larger things. And we focus just on that first stage, because over time we sort of say, okay, we want to build more confidence in the idea, and they sort of are a bit more execution focused the further down the pipeline you go. But on that early stage, so I spent maybe 2 years in this team and have somewhere a spreadsheet of 100 ideas that we looked at during those 2 years. And many you can very quickly, kind of score off the list, because maybe the impact's not going to be there. It's like, okay, this is an exciting technology, but the problem's just not big enough. It's too small. It's not going to have the scale of impact that we need. But then others, you say, okay, well, there's like huge problems, very clear, but we don't know the technology is going to work. And so that's where we might spend some time, and it could be days, weeks, or months, kind of really digging into, is the tech at the right level of readiness? Is it going to solve this problem? Is it the right solution for this problem? And I think at various points in that journey, you can have kind of various types of different brainstorms and discussions. So, often in the very early stages, these are very casual conversations, right? So we don't necessarily put a lot of formality around things. It's more like, oh, I'm really interested in this problem. Who else in my team or in the building, is an expert in this? And one thing I love about X is we're quite small, like, a few hundred people. And yet everyone's often on their like third or fourth or fifth area of expertise. And so sometimes you can kind of pop in the factory chat like, oh, I want to talk to an expert in neuromodulation, or I want to talk to an expert in, ultralight robotics, or an expert in, and
That's awesome.
Sure enough, someone's like, oh yeah, and like my last company, or oh, my PhD was in that, or well, like the best one is, oh, here's a paper I cited on this exact thing that I wrote, 2 years ago. And so there's normally like a huge wealth of information, just very easily accessible. And those conversations are often very casual, very kind of like, what if, like, oh, great, like you're an expert in this field, like, do you think it's possible that this could go mainstream soon? Like how, what are the big tech risks that are left? Like how crazy are these ideas? And I've got somewhere a list of good questions to ask kind of field experts. And there are also things like, okay, what do you think would be necessary for this to be solved at scale, right? Like, the kind of classic wave your magic wand, like give me a wish list sort of question. And then digging into some of those and figuring out, okay, well, what would it actually look like for that to be a reality? Like, is that magic wand item like really magic, or could we, with 5 to 10 years of hard work, actually make that a reality? So those are kind of some of the very early, almost formative questions, like trying to understand what are the different, like what is the shape of the problem, what are the big, the hurdles, the challenges in a particular space, and then also learning about the state of the technology. And then as these ideas get a little bit more crisp, we might have more structured pre-mortems are a great example, or more structured discussions where we say, okay, we can now articulate a future. Like we can articulate a world where, my granny can live at her in her own home for longer because she can very easily put on this pair of trousers, and, when she starts to get a little bit unstable, it will stabilize her, for example. So we can sort of picture a future like that. And then we say, okay, well, what are the big risks between now and then? And we often call these monkeys, which is funny, but that's because there's an analogy about, okay, if you wanted to build a talking monkey on a pedestal, if that's the future that you want, you're like, okay, great, we want to have a talking monkey on a pedestal. The temptation for many people is to start by building a pedestal, because you know how to do that. You're like, great, I can build some bricks, I can do this engineering work. But that's not really going to get you any closer to the outcome, because the hard bit is getting the monkey to talk, right? Mm-hmm. And so next we say, well, first we want to understand what are the really hard bits of this problem? Like, what is equivalent to
I love that. Yeah.
teaching a monkey to talk? And if we know that that's possible, then it's like, okay, well, it's easy to build the pedestal. So yes, there's still work to do that, but I would much rather take the bet on something where we've understood and made progress on like the really hardest parts of the problem. Mm-hmm. And then say we've sort of de-risked that area, and then the rest is like a little bit more execution focused. Right. So we might say, okay, well, what are the different kind of monkeys? What are the different shapes of risks and problems? And then have really targeted discussions about what is the one experiment that might increase your confidence in that. And I think the other important thing to note there before I shut up, because I've talked your ear off about this, is
no, this is great.
Is these early experiments, it's not about going from not possible to possible, right? Like the talking monkey, like we're not going to overnight prove that we can teach a monkey to talk, but it's about what takes our confidence from maybe 1% to 3% or to 5%. So in these early stages, most of these ideas are still not likely to work, right? Like they're still more likely than not to fail. But what are some things that take it from really crazy to like, oh, there's like just a hint of an idea here that it might be tractable. And we often will use as a proxy, like it's a good sign if, 5 out of 10 people that you talk to think the idea is madness. But you just need a couple of your kind of experts, a couple of people who are really deep in the work who say, that's very bold, that's very ambitious, but maybe you're onto something. You just want like a little bit of a positive signal at that stage, and that's enough for us to say there's something worth digging into.
Yeah, I was going to say I love this approach to problem solving, ideating. From an engineering principles perspective, you want to identify what your biggest risks are and figure out how you might address them before you then go in and put in a lot of resources, energy, time, humans towards solving something, to then have to swallow the frog at the end, and it's too big of a frog to put down your throat. And then I love what you just talked about as well, about being non-consensus, not most people thinking you're batshit crazy. But then some of them are like, wow, this could actually work. And if you can figure out what the risks are, you can plow forward. How are you So then are you hiring with people in mind to create this kind of culture? How are you embedding this culture within your processes? And it's so important in being able to experiment in this way.
Great question. Because it's so hard. Like, it's so counter to how most people operate, to frequently kill projects, to suggest ideas that are probably not going to work, to be very dispassionate. So I do feel like we have to bend over backwards to try and encourage it, to make it easier to constantly reinforce it. Some examples, like definitely when we hire first and foremost for culture fit, especially in these early pipelines. And so a lot of our interview questions are talking about, one of my favorite interview questions is, tell me about a time you recently changed your mind on something. Like you had a firm belief and then you realized it was wrong, right? So it's like not just killing a project, but being willing to have a strong conviction and then be moved by data or by information, I think is really important. So we do screen for that in the interview process. We've also tried to design all of our kind of formal performance and promotion kind of mechanisms around how we approach problem solving rather than the outcome, right? So what we don't want is a situation where you're only going to get recognized, as a high achiever if your project succeeds, because actually the people who are most useful to X are the ones who will quickly kill the first 20 ideas that cross their plate in order to eventually find the last one. So we try and celebrate those people. That can be everything from, we give out bonuses when a team kills their own project, right? So we say like, congratulations, like that's a real celebratory moment. They'll often like share out, at an all hands meeting, or they'll send a written postmortem, and we give them kind of a formal reward for doing so. Again, our kind of performance criteria are all about how you show up, right? Are you being dispassionate when you assess things? Are you being audacious, right? We'd rather you take big risks. And so we'll reward someone who is taking repeatedly like big ideas and big risks, much more so than someone who successfully like achieves the things they set out to do, but they didn't shoot as far to begin with.
Right. On this rewarding people for killing their projects, it makes me think of academia. And in academia, you're rewarded for publishing papers. And sadly, I think we had too many papers published that we may need to implement this sort of process there. And then this makes me think about, you guys are 12 years young at this point. You're within a larger corporation. What else are you doing to preserve creativity, to preserve your nimbleness? How is X creating this type of environment?
Yeah. There's definitely many advantages, but also some challenges to being part of Alphabet. So we do have a really distinct culture. So for example, like our promotion process is very different. Our hiring process is very different because we want to recognize that it is a different thing to try and take these big risks. And we don't want all of the other teams at Alphabet to adopt this mindset. Like that would be a bad thing for like critical infrastructure. And so as much as possible, we do sometimes feel like a bit of a sort of an island, or we're very separate. So we don't necessarily feel like we're part of Alphabet in some of the cultural day-to-day things. On the other hand, there are so many great benefits to this. So, even when I started my project, for example, this one about how do we help movement and assist movement, one of our monkeys, one of our big questions where I was like, well, if we can't do this, there's no point, is I said, we're going to need to be able to differentiate between very subtly different movements based on a very small amount of sensor data. So an example is, imagine you are going to lift a heavy box. That's a good moment where you probably want assistance, right? Like we want to help you stand up, carrying this heavy item. But now imagine you're going down to tie your shoelace. Well, the first half of that movement is exactly the same. You're crouching. But the last thing you want when tying your shoelace is your pants trying to like shove you upright to try and help you stand up when you're trying to like stay crouched tying a shoelace, right? Like that would be terrible. And this could be even more problematic if we start to think about, people who are less stable, or they're a trip risk, like we just need to be like so accurate in understanding human movement, but without adding tons of sensors to people in a way that's really cumbersome. So we said, like that's one of our monkeys. Like we want to do an experiment to answer that. And if I was in a startup environment, it would just be really hard to convince like a really impressive, machine learning expert to tackle this problem with no guaranteed success, for a short period of time, et cetera. Whereas being part of Alphabet, we could pull on, an amazing team of people within X who are kind of experts in machine learning, and then even the broader Alphabet system, right? It turns out Alphabet has done some modeling on understanding human movement and doing that from cameras. And so we had some of this infrastructure and kind of data pipelines already built. And so, we could do some of that early de-risking much quicker. And so in summary, yes, we try and keep a very distinct culture, but we also try and, lean into the things that are great about Alphabet, which is particularly kind of access to talent, to engineering. And also I think it gives us a nice place where we can contribute moderate successes. And so, although I spoke at the beginning about what we want, it's like world-changing moonshot. And ideally, you know very quickly whether something will be that scale or not before you invest a lot of time and effort. But of course, there are some projects where, we get kind of halfway through and we say, the technology does work, but it's just going to be like a slightly smaller application than we had originally thought. And in those cases, Alphabet often wants to absorb some of them because they're like, you've created a really valuable thing. And so it's really nice to be able to say, great, this team can kind of be absorbed back into Alphabet and continue to contribute the way that they can best and use the technology best without it being a total write-off.
And I believe I read that some of the first ideas for X to work on came from Sergey and Larry. And you just brought up right now how the ideas are generated are folks will come and say, hey, how about this idea? How about that idea? And then it needs to meet these criteria to be qualified as a moonshot, meaning huge problem, breakthrough technology, and then feasible to execute on. I wonder whether you have examples of the opposite where you come with all of these criteria and then say, what are ideas we can fulfill? So for instance, you can come with self-driving cars. This is breakthrough technology. We're making a ton of progress, huge impact for humanity, executable, but there are challenges. And so what are applications we can come up with? Do you all ever take that approach?
Yes. So when I was in Rapid Eval, you would see both. And I think when it worked best was also when, so I think individual people in that team might have different approaches as well. And so there are some people who are real technologists, right? Their favorite thing to do is to read all the latest journal articles, be on top of the emerging technology, and think about how can we use this? And then other people on the team who knew a lot about some of the biggest problems in the world, and they were thinking about how do we improve aging, how do we improve, hunger, how do we improve, internet access. And so some of the best conversations were when people would be kind of just discussing these different things that they'd heard about, and you would see someone on this side be, you just said there was this breakthrough in this technology. I was trying to think of a solution for the problem I have over here. Let's kind of bring them together.
That's awesome.
And so you do see ideas come from both the technology and from the problem space. And in the very early kind of stages, it's fine if it's more one than the other. I think by the time we want it to transition from a very, very kind of early exploration into a more well-defined problem or project, at that point they normally have a good articulation, or they should have a good articulation of both the technology and the problem. So it's kind of fine if it starts more from one side, but what we don't want to do is come up with technology that doesn't really solve any problem in the world, doesn't really solve any need. And so that's a very strong filter that we put on now.
Makes sense. And on this note, I want to ask you if you could share with me projects that you've either led, been a part of, that you can walk us through. But before we go there, I am so curious, what are some of the craziest ideas you've heard? And then what are some of the bad ones that got nicked that you can share?
Craziest ideas. So there's a project which is now public, so I can talk about it, about ocean sustainability, right? It's how can we improve the health of the oceans while still providing particularly food for a lot of people who rely on fish for protein. And one of the problems that you have in fish farming is sea lice. And, sea lice can attack the fish and, mean that you have to write off a whole crop of fish, which can be devastating for a farmer. It's also sad for the fish, right? That's not a great outcome for anyone. And traditional treatments are often very chemical heavy, which is not great. And so we were brainstorming, are there better ways to treat lice? And part of the problem is fish move in these densely packed shoals, right?
Mm.
And so any non kind of chemical approach, if you wanted a mechanical remover, how do you separate the fish from each other? This is kind of painful. And so one of the craziest ideas someone came up with was, okay, well, what if you put a laser backpack on fish? Like, what if you just took 1 in 100 fish, gave them a backpack? You don't really need a battery because you can power it by the swimming of the fish, right? So like that would be enough to like recharge a little laser. So like fish swims, you know, and every 10 meters it's kind of recharge its laser. And then on the fish backpack, it's got a camera and it's looking for like a parasite on another fish, and it will spot a parasite and it will shoot a laser, you know, and then it will keep swimming. And it kind of works because the fish are like in the shoal, right? So if you try to do this outside, like you're never going to be able to get to the fish that are in the middle.
Penetrate.
And you know, and so we got quite deep into this conversation, and it's not a bad idea when you go into the weeds. But then at some point you're like, are we in a James Bond movie? Like, are we really talking about putting like laser backpacks on fish? Like, what? So I think that was my favorite of the kind of wild ideas.
I'm picturing how you would get to all the shoals of fish around the world and like have this mission of putting this on their backpacks, and then some form of tracking to see how it's going.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, this has not yet been deployed as a real solution.
Okay, so that's a great one.
No. And then you also asked about kind of, I was trying to think of bad ideas. I mean, there are so many ideas that just don't work. I mean, maybe on a more serious note, to contrast with the laser backpack fish, I actually think there are many ideas that we propose which come from a really good place, where you know, someone in the organization sees a huge problem in the world and they really want to solve it. And so they're trying to find a technology that, like, if you squint, like solves a problem. But if you thought deeply about kind of what's actually happening in the world and the dynamics of that problem, you might say, well, I'm not really sure that Alphabet is the right person to solve that problem. Like, it's not really a problem that's well suited to technology. So I think those I mean, it's like a less fun answer, but I think the kind of the bad ideas that are the hardest to wind down as projects are where like you really want the solution to exist. You know, like maybe it's going after water insecurity, right? Or like war and conflict. And it's like, I would love these problems to be solved. Yeah. But like, can we imagine the technology that we're creating, like solving that? Is there a risk that we make it worse? You know, is Alphabet the right organization to be tackling some of those? And so I think those are the ones which are like bad ideas in the sense of it's probably not going to go anywhere, but they're also actually the hardest to kill because everyone's so motivated to try and find the answer.
Yeah, that makes sense. And coming from a public policy and development background, this so resonates for us. Are we learning anything from Loon and the impacts there with providing internet lessons for an X or any other innovation lab?
So many. And I'm not an expert in Loon either, so I don't want to speak too far outside my expertise. But I think there are two really interesting things about Loon. So in the end, we wound down part of that project. And that was also sad for people because it was one of these where internet accessibility is a huge problem. And the technology worked almost perfectly. You know, like, yes, nothing's ever quite perfect, but fundamentally the technology worked. The problem is they couldn't figure out the business model. And they had actually spent some time looking at this beforehand. You know, like, of course they weren't silly enough to spend this much time and effort without having a thought here. But what was sad is they knew that the people in the rural communities would be willing to pay the amount that it would cost to deliver the internet. Like the fundamentals worked out. They just couldn't figure out like how to do it through existing telecommunications providers, and it doesn't make sense for Loon to be a new one. And it's one of these where the problem is the average price, right? Like the average price that a person is willing to pay for internet is cheaper than we can provide with balloons. But and that people aren't served, like they would love to have internet access at this price. There's just no mechanism for doing that at the moment.
Right. This makes me think of, for instance, Google Lens, which came out, I think it was 2014 and almost was too early for its time, and makes me feel like Loon probably is a bit early at the moment. And once we have progress in terms of infrastructure, more penetration of phones where people in villages can use them, so maybe that can get revisited a few decades down the line.
Well, I was going to say the second interesting part of the Loon story is that we kind of wound down that project as it existed, which was very balloon focused. But because the technology was actually quite effective, and the most difficult thing that they'd had to solve is how to get balloons to communicate to each other like in the middle of high altitude environments with a lot of movement between the balloons and still maintain a connection here. And so that was a lot of free space optics was the technology that they'd really refined for that. And they said, well, actually, that doesn't need to be on a balloon to be useful. And so although they kind of wound down Loon, a project that kind of was like emerged from the ashes, like a phoenix, it's called Tara, and it's also public now. And it's doing really well, where they said, oh, let's just take that bit of technology, the free space optics that's providing the internet, and there are places where you can put that on the ground and have it be really useful. For example, they just crossed the Congo River. So the Congo River is notoriously like deep and wide, and so it's really difficult to get a fiber optic cable under. And so there are many places where a city on one side of the river might have internet, but the other side just doesn't. And it's such a short distance, but if you can't get a cable under, it's too long to get a cable round. And so there are these instances where they say, oh, we can put like a free space optics sort of device on a pole on either side of the river, and much like up in the atmosphere, like stabilizing and transmitting internet between balloons, the exact same technology almost they can now use to provide internet across the Congo River, and gave us internet to almost a whole town.
Very cool. I had not heard of Tara, so
it's fairly newish still, and there aren't many instances where this makes sense in the for many reasons, such as this is a bit more subject to weather, for example, than a cable would. So when you can put a cable down, that's a great solution. But if you can't put a cable down, you can give people access to internet 99% of the time for a fraction of the cost, which is a great deal for people. So yeah, like it was a good example where even when the original idea kind of fails, it doesn't mean that there aren't parts of it that become really useful.
Exactly. You always learn something from your failures that you can move forward with. Okay, so let me ask you to share a project that you've worked on then.
Sure. I can tell about the project I'm currently working on because it's kind of gone the furthest through the pipeline, but it's worth knowing that, I've probably worked, 100 early ideas and then maybe 6 or 7 kind of medium-sized ones. So, as I mentioned, I became interested in this by looking at aging.
Yeah.
So it's one of these instances where like my day job was hanging out with the most intelligent people in the world discussing all these breakthrough technologies. And at the same time, my grandmother was just struggling. She was 95 and had recently lost her husband and kind of wanted to live alone or wanted to stay in her own home, but didn't have necessarily the support and assistance to do that. And I was spending a lot of time going over and being with her. And the contrast between the kind of future that we were imagining at work and then like the daily life of someone who, just wants to be able to do their own grocery shopping, to do the gardening, to cook dinner. I was very motivated to okay, I want to see if we can make life easier, not in every domain, but in some domains. And so I started almost like a family of investigations that are all aging related, right? And so a lot of my early days were just talking to people. So talking to experts in geriatrics on kind of the more medical side, talking to a lot of older adults about like what most matters to them, what do they wish they could do that they can't currently do, understanding what the requirements of any sort of solutions might be. And ended up kind of sort of breaking the problem into a few different spaces. And I can talk through some of the logic of why we're now concentrating on mobility, which is not to say that we would never touch in these spaces again, but just my thinking process as an individual. I really cared about Alzheimer's, for example. And ideally we want to cure Alzheimer's. And that is clearly a solution that people should be working on and are working on. And I do not have like any useful skills to contribute that, right? So when I looked into that space, I said, okay, this is probably a pharmacological solution. There's a lot of research happening. I'm glad that it's happening. Like, should exist, probably not like the thing that I'm
not the one to solve it.
Mm-hmm. There were parts of Alzheimer's support that were interesting. So already many people have in their home like a Google Home or an Amazon Alexa. And a lot of the things that I was calling my granny about, to some extent, could be automated. Basic things such as, today is Tuesday. Remember that the postman comes on Tuesday. Or, we've just done the shopping for the week. that means that tonight you should have the chicken for dinner, whereas to like meal planning almost,
Right.
to the more micro, like, well, we turn the oven on, like 20 minutes later, let's make sure we turn the oven off again. A lot of those sorts of kind of just check-ins almost, and kind of helping people put themselves in context, right? So when you have early stage Alzheimer's, you can do any individual task and live in the moment fairly well, but you just sometimes lost the context about where you are. And so I do think there's a lot of scope for the devices that are already in people's homes to provide more reminders, more support, more check-ins in a way that doesn't have to be super intrusive, but could provide a lot of value to people with early Alzheimer's. So I spent some time looking at that idea, but it's a good example of one where it's actually too easy for X to be interested. By which I mean, like, that technology should exist, but it's probably more like 1 or 2 years away, not like 5 to 10 years away. And we have such scarce resources that that's a problem probably better tackled by other parts of Alphabet, right? So we actually end up talking a lot to the assistant team and said, can you look at just including this, in part of your workflow, or done by potentially a startup, right? Like there's no real need for this to be such a transformative breakthrough moonshot. That could just be a product, right? So that was kind of Alzheimer's as an example of a branch that we kind of looked at, and then we looked down kind of physical health and went through a similar process of what are some of the most common ailments, what are getting people's way, what do they really want? And just one more example of many that we looked at. Something that came out of a lot of the user interviews was incontinence. So a lot of, like, when you ask, not every, but some older adults, when you say, what do you wish you could do with less support or more independently or don't have a good solution for, going to the bathroom is often number 1 or 2 on the list. Yeah. Because it's so associated with dignity as well, right? Like, you want to be independent. You don't want to have to ask people for help with that, or it's embarrassing. Well, sometimes you'd have to kind of dig into some stories, right? Someone might say, I wish I could travel more. And I say, well, why can't you travel? It's like, it's too hard. It's like, well, but what? Talk me through it. Why is it too hard? The answer is, well, if I have to go to the bathroom too often, I can't go on a bus trip because, it's embarrassing or it's impractical or the bus doesn't stop enough or I can't drive or I'm not confident in it. And so I was really interested in that as a problem area. And of course, it doesn't have that much attention going to it relative compared to some of the other areas, precisely because it's not the kind of sexy thing that a 22-year-old Stanford graduate, is excited about working on. But it will be so life-changing for some people. But again, kind of when we dug into, okay, but is there a good emerging technology? Like, is there a breakthrough technology that could help with that problem that Alphabet is well suited to solve? We couldn't really find a slam dunk. Whereas human movement, kind of mobility, knee pain, joint movement, falls are another big one. That emerged as another huge problem area, which enabled lots of different stages of life. And one where when you ask people what they want in a solution, they often say they want it to be hands-free, something they can kind of put on and forget about, something that will let them control, like they might want to move under their own power for most of the time, but just the hill at the end of the walk they struggle with. They just wish they had help up that hill, something like that. And the more we talked about the shapes of solutions that might work for people, and then kind of overlaid that with, well, where is current technology at? A lot of academics have been working on exoskeletons. There'd been some work from the military, all of which was not appropriate for this application, but showed that the underlying technology was getting there, right? That motors and batteries were at a point where these could be lightweight and really useful products. And so that was kind of how that investigation went from a really broad, like aging is like this huge thing, broke it down into different problem areas, looked at kind of what technologies could solve different problems. And I probably spent like more than a year just getting smart and learning about the problem spaces, the technologies, meeting experts, going to conferences, before settling on, okay, this is, of all of those different things, physical movement is something that makes sense for us to actually spin up some very targeted explorations in. So
were you doing this by yourself when you were going to all these conferences, getting smart at this point?
Yeah, so I was working in a team of rapid evaluators, And they were sort of brain partners. So I got a lot of
Okay.
help and discussion from them, but definitely was something where an individual was kind of leading the structuring and the thinking. But the next stage, which is, okay, once we'd kind of settled on this, I then scoped what are the experiments that would move that probability needle from 1 to 3%. And that was a point when we started to do things like hire residents. So often PhD students who'd done their PhD in this area, and we could convince them to come out for 6 months for a well-defined, like, probably nothing will happen at the end of the 6 months, but we want to just do this 1 or 2 experiments. Or, leaning into partnerships or vendors. Like, in these early stages, we didn't hire full-time team members because probably the project wouldn't exist beyond that. But I found, particularly residents and collaborations, like good ways to do short experiments to build confidence.
Right.
And then it was maybe 2 years later that we actually hired our first kind of full-time employee.
Wow. And where is the project now?
We're still in the kind of de-risking exploration stage, but we've gone from, early experiments were very specific, targeted, answer a question sort of experiments. And we actually increased our confidence in the technology a lot. So that means that our next monkey, like the next kind of big question, is less tech focused. And it's about, okay, but will people actually keep wearing this? And I am especially worried about placebo and novelty effects. So we can get really good feedback in our lab, right? Like someone can come in and they can try a prototype and they can say, oh yeah, that really helped me climbing the stairs. But in the next breath, they'll say, but, like there are wires hanging out and it took like 10 minutes to put on. And there's like lots of caveats there. And so for us, like the next big monkey is, will people wear it, when we're not looking, when they're at home, and the novelty's worn off.
Is it practical?
Yeah. And for that, we need some more integrated prototypes. So we're kind of actually doing a shift in our team of doing separate experiments into, for the first time, trying to build a prototype that can do all of this in a package that looks closer to a product. So that's what we're working on now, but we're still in a sort of very high risk early stage exploration. So it's still a very small team and we're still trying to answer some of these questions, but with a bit more seriousness than in the rapid eval team.
And definitely customers all the time don't want to hurt your feelings to your face and say very nice things to you to your face. And you need to really get to the root of, but are they going to actually use it when I'm not here? So that's a very smart test to perform in monkey 2D risk. But this sounds so cool, Kathryn. What a cool job. You're basically thinking about big moonshot problem areas that need solving with technology that requires significant development, and then getting smart, working toward it. I can think of so many people who, for them, this is their dream job. How does a student or a researcher or talented human excited to come work at X get to X? What advice do you have?
There are 2 typical ways that people might join X. The most common way is that you're hired onto a project. And so just because that's where most humans in the building are kind of working. And so for that, the advice is just be exceptional, like at the problem that you're solving. And which I know sounds dumb, but if you're
I thought you said just be exceptional.
Just be exceptional. Like, well, full stop. It's a great start. But so for example, when we were starting to get more serious about wearable robotics, I just asked everyone I met, who are the best people in the field on this, right?
Yeah.
And of course, like X might not have a project in your area, but you should pick an area that you're passionate about. And if X doesn't have a project, well, then just don't come to X, problem solved.
Yep.
If you're lucky enough that like you're working on a project that you find really, or a problem space that you find really interesting, and X is also interested in the problem space, that's kind of the most common way to join X. The other way is to be hired onto one of these very early teams. That's less common just because they're smaller, right? So the rapid eval team is, less than a dozen people often, whereas the larger projects will have many more on them. And then we really look for people who are, we'd often say T-shaped, by which we mean deeply technical in a thing, because what we care about is your ability to get deeply technical and very smart about any particular problem, but then also really broad. So curious about the world, interested in learning about new problems, trying different things, And that's sort of a very classic shape. For example, my current manager, she's great. She was a musician focused on improv for a while in her career. Like, that's not at all tech related, but that's like, it's so X, right? Somehow that like, that someone who's done this really compelling, interesting thing over here, and it hints at the kind of person who's curious about the world, who wants to try different things.
Right.
So yeah, like, we're not necessarily looking for the person who's got perfect A's on, you know, a very linear career trajectory. I think we're more interested in people who think differently, try different things, are curious, are excited about the world, and are willing to learn and try and fail.
Yeah, love it. And learning and trying and failing and being open to that feedback, super important. You have an incredible story. Let's talk a little bit about you and how you got to X. Kathryn, you grew up in Australia. I hope I have this right because you spent so much time all over the world that let me know if I missed anything. You grew up in Australia. You were a physics and math nerd, won challenges, and then you have like 4 master's degrees. You spent time in development. And when you got to X, it felt so perfectly a collision of all your interests in terms of being nerdy and physics and math and being so curious about the world and wanting to impact and develop. So tell me about what your journey was like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said it perfectly. So yeah, I was a huge nerd. And I think I also fell into that trap early in my career of I was good at something and people kept saying I was good at something. So I kept doing it. And I did love kind of the process of learning, but I was on that kind of treadmill of, you know, you're good at something in high school, you then study at university. I was good enough at university, so I sort of signed up for a PhD. And I never really stopped to question, what do I want to do in the world? Like, what do I want my kind of day-to-day life to be? And what do I want my contribution to society to be? I just kind of said yes to whatever the next obvious step was. And the more time that I spent in physics, the less that I actually loved it. And I think the reason for that is that I loved learning about physics. Like, I loved the stage when you're, you know, in an undergrad lab, like doing a hands-on experiment. And in one experiment, you can like determine like the value of gravity. And you're like, that's so cool, you know, and this is like how they did it, you know, centuries ago. And I felt like the more I got into academic research, the less it was learning something new every day. And the more it was, you know, work on like a very, very small part of this huge problem, you know, often sort of more isolated as well. And for me, it felt less connected to the world. Now, that's because I also made the mistake of picking the most theoretical topic I could imagine. I started my PhD in theoretical astrophysics, looking at the gravitational entropy of objects just before they become a black hole.
Very cool.
Well, cool to say, but like...
I know a couple of girls who are obsessed with black holes right now, so they're trying to learn everything they can. But yeah, continue. Cool to say, but very theoretical. It's like, how could you ever measure this?
Right. And my entire topic that I'd spent maybe a couple of years looking at that point was looking at one term of one equation for entropy. So I was like, basically this, you know, when black holes form, there's a discontinuity in entropy. That normally means our equations are wrong. Like, it's not very likely that there's a sudden change in a physical attribute. So I was just trying to like add a term to this equation to fix it. But that's so small. Like, that's so small in the sense of, you know,
right,
spending years of your life on this like one very narrow thing. And then I also found the day-to-day not ideal for me, is maybe a good way to say it.
Yeah.
Like, very individual, very theoretical. You know, a lot of the work was like by myself in my little room. We did have a window, which was great. But
thank goodness.
But yeah, like I'd missed that kind of early, the love of physics was also often with people and like working on a problem together. And I think I started to lose that. So I actually dropped out of my PhD program. I think the other thing to say is I probably didn't have the maturity in that moment to know how to self-manage, right? Like, I think now if I was in a similar situation, I might say, well, I just know that I'm an extrovert. I need more kind of energy in my life, or I need to structure my time better. I think I also struggled with the years of life working on that one little thing, and I needed some intermediate milestones.
Yeah.
But dropping out was probably the best thing I could have done. I mean, obviously very challenging in the moment. And I actually remember I didn't even frame it to myself as dropping out because that felt too much like failing. And at that point, I wasn't yet on the bandwagon of how good failure was. So instead, I took a break. And so I said, okay, I'll just put this on pause. And I didn't know what to do. But I'm a scientist. And so classic scientist, I was like, well, I'll do an experiment. So I thought I'll pause the PhD because I don't know if the problem is like academia in general or just my very specific subject. So I'll pause the PhD and I'll take 2 years out and I'll spend 1 year doing the best thing I can find in physics that's not my particular topic. So that's like testing, is a problem just my topic area? And then I'll do a year of something that is as different as I could possibly find and change, like, you know, and in particular leave physics and look at something that feels more impactful, because I did have a sense that I was craving doing something more meaningful. So that's what I did. So I did like a 2-year experiment. The year of the best physics I could find was a master's program at this institute in Canada, which is amazing. They just do theoretical physics. No one's ever heard of them, but they're like top of the field in this and like surrounded by some of the best minds, learning about some of the best stuff. And that was good. But I definitely enjoyed more the year that I spent basically volunteering for an NGO. So this was a nonprofit that worked in international criminal justice. So they did a lot of evidence collection for the International Criminal Court. They worked on human rights issues. And they were essentially started and ran by some incredibly talented human rights lawyers. Now, it may have escaped your notice, I'm not a lawyer. I was in no way qualified for this job. Like, I mean, So one thing that was really interesting about that is I was like, oh, like, how am I going to be useful here? Mm-hmm. But I learned another lesson that year, which is sometimes I think you can be most useful because you're different, right? And so they actually didn't need someone to do any more legal work for them. They had many better people at that. What I could do is, you know, do a repair on a BlackBerry in the field somewhere. You know, I could start them a website. This is back when websites were a novel new idea, and very quickly spin that kind of thing up. You know, do some basic accounting analysis for them, things like that. And so, if anything, being more quantitative and a little bit more techie meant that I could do useful, if not particularly high-powered work for them.
You can also provide different perspectives, help them think about something in a way they've never thought about before, ask questions they've never questioned. Why do we actually do things this way? Help them be more creative.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to be fair, at that point, I was still like the intern, you know, so I probably, to their credit, I wasn't exactly, you know, providing meaningful critique.
They were like, get the coffee. You're like, but why do we need someone to get coffee?
Exactly. But now that's exactly how that manifests, right? So the same thing that back then it was, oh, I'm just useful because I can fix a BlackBerry, you know. And of course now I think you're right, like at a higher level, being different allows you to bring these different perspectives. But it was a good early lesson in that. Anyway, I'm going on a long tangent, but I did this.
Right. And then you got somehow in there, you also got an MBA. Was this because you wanted to get the breadth to add to the depth of the tea?
Oh, that was way after. Okay. I feel like I need to step through the whole story, although it's now going to be long and you'll have to edit it way down. So I did this experiment. And the reason I spent a long time on this is I actually really advocate experiments in a career. I think it's so common to be in that situation of, oh, I don't like what I'm currently doing, but I don't know what to do next. Like, well, how would anyone know, right? Like, you can't possibly experience everything in the world. And a year of each is a big commitment. But I think whenever someone's curious about something, finding, like, reframing it as, oh, I'm not going to quit my job and start a new career. Like, that's really scary. Frame it as, oh, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to take a sabbatical. I'm going to take 6 months off. I'm going to quit this job. And before I take the next kind of job that's in the very linear direction, I'm going to take some time to try something really different. I think is something that that more people should try. And I also want to recognize there's some privilege in that, right? Like, it's hard to give up a very safe career path if you don't have a little bit of a financial cushion or parents are supportive, etc. But to the extent that you can, I think that's a really compelling way to just gain more conviction about what you want to do in the world.
Totally. I also advocate doing a bunch of internships. So try maybe 4 internships in 1 year, 3 months each in various industries. You can make money. You're going to learn so much. I feel like the first 3 months is always the most intense anyway, getting to soak up everything in this new industry, processes, subject matter, etc. And that's a great use of time.
Exactly. And it's so interesting that it's so natural for people to think about doing that when they're in university or in grad school. And then we sort of lose that muscle. But there's actually no
Right.
reason that someone who's, in their 30s couldn't do that in the same way that someone in their 20s can.
I feel like I just did that.
yeah, you're a great example.
It's such a good point. Why do we lose this notion of learning? Life is about continuous learning. There's always something to learn. You end up I'm learning from my nieces who are teaching me about the world as they see it, and will continue to do that. And so seeing the world and careers or what you're doing, what you're passionate about in that lens, and coming up with ways to keep experimenting. So then you did that, and then what happened? We can abridge it.
Yeah, the abridged version is so I much preferred the kind of nonprofit impact work. So then spent most of the next decade working in that space, and really enjoyed it. Felt really high impact. I think one thing that in my 20s I hadn't thought I should be prioritizing was any sort of sense of quality of life other than in the work context. So when I made that decision, that was kind of right in my 20s. But of course, it led to many years of like lots of travel, living in remote places. The last job I had before I met you was in kind of agriculture development. We'd start these kind of small processing factories that would then be able to help farmers, get more value from their crops because they can kind of sell a high value crop. Really great businesses, like, couldn't say better things about that kind of approach, except for the fact that it meant that I was living in quite rural communities. Right. I didn't speak the language particularly well. I would try, but I have no talent for it. And I think there are a couple of things that came together at once. One is, I think a broader sort of questioning of, like, am I the right person to be doing this work? Like, often my job was to start up some of these companies and then try and hand them over to a local general manager. And I was just feeling increasingly uncomfortable as, like, the white woman, coming in with like the capital and like
the solutions for you.
Yeah, didn't love that.
It's not you. So.
Right, like a bit awkward. And at the same time, like honestly, I hadn't held down any serious relationships, but it was such a high travel, like very rural based job that that wasn't really realistic. But even friendships as well. Like I had a very limited social life. Well, my social life was the expat community in some of these places, which is, again, didn't feel like the kind of person I wanted to be longer term.
Right.
And so that was when I came to America. And I think the challenge I had in that moment is I'd done all this early experimentation in a career to find a job which did tick all of my job boxes, right? Like it ticked everything that I sort of decided I wanted in life.
Yeah. And
I loved it for so long, but I just over time, wanted more personally. Like it almost felt like quite a selfish decision. And I'd not put any time into thinking about, well, what do I want in life outside of a career? Like that was kind of a foreign concept. And so I didn't really know what to do. I was again in this kind of stuck, I've solved for everything and I'm still not super happy moment. But I'd never been to America. I said never lived here. I think I'd been through an airport once or twice. And it felt like this huge country that was such a mystery to me. And because my original kind of undergrad degrees had all been in physics and mathematics, and that was a really different world to what I was now in, I thought I might enjoy doing something like an MBA to just meet people and kind of have another cohort of adult friends, right? Like, particularly because I'd come from this environment, like I didn't have that many friends like from undergrad because they all stayed in physics and I didn't. And then I'd spent a few years working in these very remote places that didn't really have any strong adult friendships. And I find it quite difficult to make adult friends like just randomly.
It's tough,
It's tough. And I was like, even if all I get from this MBA is like a chance to form like a new cohort of people who are maybe interested in similar things to what I'm interested in, that would be amazing. And I did. So that was great. And then coming out of that, I was trying to decide what to do next. And wanting to balance, okay, I'm really good at science, haven't flexed that muscle in a while. I want to have impact, like the kind of impact I was having in this previous job. But I also want to live somewhere where I could imagine raising a family. And a friend of mine heard me say this, and she was at X, and she was like, you've just described X, like that is our day job. And I'd actually never heard of X before that. But she was a very close friend of mine and a very strong advocate for me in the organization as well. So she helped me kind of get an interview. And, I'm one of those people which like, may not have been an obvious fit for any of the projects, But when you look at...
But that's like, you're perfect.
Yeah, that kind of
everything you just described about yourself, yeah.
Yeah, so they were lucky enough to... Oh, no, I was lucky enough that they gave me...
No, they were lucky enough.
That wasn't a Freudian slip. I was like, so I actually only did 6 months initially, because...
To help out with a project?
Yeah, to be fair, I actually joined on a very specific project for a few months and then ended up turning into the rapid eval team. But yeah, like just to try it out, same idea. I was like, it's an experiment, and it was one of those experiments I didn't want to finish. Yeah. So here I am years later.
Beautiful. A couple of things I want to highlight from what you described. One, in your 20s, you were traveling a ton, experimenting based off of what you discovered while you were going for your PhD, that, hey, actually, I don't really enjoy this. I need more people. Let me experiment and try different things. That is incredible, I think, maturity for you at that time to say, I'm going to run these experiments. I'm going to do a year this one, a year that one. I love it. Let's do more of that. And you can do shorter. You can do like 3 months or whatever fits your schedule, your budget. You can find ways to get paid for it. We discussed that. Second is, you mentioned as you were traveling the world doing development work, you felt a little like you weren't serving yourself. You weren't filling your cup. You weren't taking care of Kathryn. And something we've read together with Marcin, I believe the book is Flow, but don't quote me on this, is the author says, take care of yourself, your loved ones, and your passions in that order. And it's something we live by. I think it's so important to fill your own cup, whether it be making sure you're sleeping enough, eating healthily, exercising, doing the things you love, and then spending time with your loved ones, your significant other, your family, your friends, people who fill you up, and then working on your passions. And it's something that helps keep our cups full. And then third, I forgot what my third one was.
Well, I can riff on that for a minute, which is, that sounds really true. I think the other thing that happened for me was that what would fill my cup changed over time. So when I was younger, I was mission orientated, and like what was filling my cup was that sense of purpose, and I was helping the world and I was doing something impactful. And it was only as I got older that I said, actually, I also want to get more, interaction with people, more space in my life for relationships.
Love it. Totally. And we change, we evolve, and the things that matter to us evolve and change. And then the third thing that you brought up that I want to highlight is this sense of, you really had no idea you were going to end up at X. And this was your experiences taking you here. And I hear this from a lot of people. I feel similarly that where life has taken us is not something that we could have planned looking forward, but in hindsight makes a ton of sense. So being open to experiences and learning from them is really, really cool thing. So thank you for sharing your experience with us, Kathryn. Cool. 2 more questions that I'm actually so interested in. One, so this is a bit of a tough spot that we're in with tech in Silicon Valley, and wanted to get your personal sense, given that you're in the space. We are seeing with the economy, layoffs in tech. How are you feeling about that? I also want to note that, for instance, I think it was 2015, 2014, Google was getting restructured into Alphabet, and there was a lot of worry about Google X, but it even strengthened Google X's position. And so just with that context, how are you feeling about the economy and changes today?
Yeah, firstly, this is going to be tough, I think, for a lot of the people who are experiencing layoffs. I also find, especially with kind of the global news at the moment, right, whether this is war and conflict in other countries, whether this is famine that looks like it's coming through, at the end of the day, I still feel so lucky to be living in a country and in a society where I don't think I personally will ever be worried about food insecurity, for example, even if I'm laid off immediately. So, with that context,
we are fortunate. Yeah,
we are still fortunate. Exactly. That said, I think it is going to be tough for a lot of tech workers in the Valley. I don't think Alphabet is immune from feeling like definitely a little bit more tight. I also think there's been some healthy criticisms around when times are really good, everyone grows in every direction, right? Like you say yes to everything and you try everything that might work. And this, we talked at the beginning about how difficult it is to kill projects. I think it's especially difficult to wind down ideas which are sort of working, but maybe not as efficient or as good as they used to be. And X is maybe a bit better at that, but I think many tech companies and Alphabet overall had a little bit of this, right? Started lots of projects. And I don't think this is a bad moment for us to take a hard look and say, well, what are we really good at? What are we really going to double down and commit to? and then maybe there are other areas where we can wind down those efforts. I don't think it's going to be like a universal kind of, cutting across the board or anything like that. And if anything, Sundar and Ruth came out recently and kind of doubled down on their support for new climate initiatives, for example. So there's definitely like still investment happening in the things that are most important. And I'm hoping it will be more of a clarifying moment of, okay, well, what is really important and what isn't really important. I also think Alphabet has an advantage of being kind of big enough and still generating plenty of revenue and things like that they can say, okay, well, what are the right long-term decisions? And X is a good example of somewhere which, of course, like it's an investment, right? Like, of course, we're costing some money now, but the idea is that we are also creating the projects which, 5, 10, 15 years from now are going to be, as significant in terms of Alphabet's portfolio as some of the existing very profitable centers. And so I've been pleasantly surprised that Ruth and Sundar are always affirming that and saying that they view X as a real source of investment and the future growth in the company. But more specifics than that, I don't really know and can't comment on. But it definitely, the feeling is a little bit more like, okay, everyone needs to be a little bit more thoughtful about how we spend money and maybe not throw budget and headcount at things unnecessarily. And to the extent that it is encouraging us to make tough decisions early, that could actually be a good thing for kind of helping us be more efficient.
And come out stronger. Bringing us back up, the technologies that are 10 years out. This is very, very cool. What's it like working with some of these technologies that are really breakthrough, cutting edge, avant-garde? And what are ones that you can share with us that you're looking forward to coming out?
Oh, I mean, as a huge science nerd, I do find it very exciting just to go to like tech talks, around X and hear about what people are working on. I should say like the day-to-day experience is often frustrating, right? Because like the way that these technologies go is you get really excited for the first hour or two that you hear about them and you work with them. And then because they're so breakthrough, nothing works, like almost all of the time you'll spend
It's
hours.
Literally breakthrough.
Exactly. They don't tell you that, the break and the breakthrough. I can share this because it's about my own project, but we were interested in the early days in soft actuators. So not just kind of having, like a solid motor, but having like really soft motors, like almost artificial muscles. Really breakthrough technology. But one of our poor interns, I swear, spent a month like trying to like by hand manufacture these things that keep breaking and and in the end of the day he had something that was like sort of worked, but when you compared it to the ease of use of just traditional electromagnetic motors, it's like, well, actually I would just rather have a small like rigid puck that you can just clip onto your knee than try and deal with these like fragile frustrating, annoying little bits. And so that's quite funny. Like, it's amazing how quickly you go from, oh, this is so cool, to like, oh, why won't my code compile? Why won't my string, stop breaking?
It's a good example, though, because it's not glamorous all the time. People think of Iron Man, the movie, or SpaceX's rockets. And, wow, that's so cool. Or Loon, or Verily, or Waymo. But it's the result of tons of hours and years of humans' dedication and time working through these small, minute details and literally piecing these parts together and making it work.
Definitely.
So that's really helpful perspective.
And especially some of these are larger team efforts. And so, like whenever anyone says, oh, we work on exoskeletons, that sounds really cool. But a more accurate description would be anyone on my team would be like, well, I work on this one sensor and it's really important for the exoskeleton. But for the last 2 months, I have been like debugging this one little sensor. But of course, you need like a team to work together like this in order to come out with something. And maybe one little build on this is I do like to have fun team moments and activities that kind of remind people of the bigger picture. And on our project, it's easier because we're working on something which is very tangible. So, for example, we often bring in like real people who experience, knee osteoarthritis or who have other kind of mobility challenges, and just having everyone on the team hear them talk about, their daily experience and then like what a technology like this could mean to them is a good way to break people out of, oh, my little sensor isn't working, to like, oh yeah, this is like why I'm doing this. Yeah, it's really
we're humans, right? And we need to be pulled out of these details and out of this well that we're bogged down into to remind ourselves of the big picture and why we're doing this and why this is exciting and all of the great things about it. So then 10 years from now, where do you think we'll be technology-wise? What bets are you placing, Kathryn?
Oh, I bet that we will have the technology necessary to mitigate or reverse a lot of climate change.
I really hope so.
I think the thing that I am hopeful but also like nervous about is whether we'll have the political will to do it. So I'm very bullish on the technology side. But as you said at the beginning, like a lot of these huge global problems, you need both technology and you need policy, or you need kind of
absolutely
stakeholders who are bought in, etc. So that's something I'm very excited about. I'm also hopeful that we will have more robots doing jobs that humans don't want to do, right? Whether this is very repetitive manual labor or whether this is dangerous tasks. And as a result of that, we'll hopefully have more humans doing jobs where like having humans really make a difference. And like to come full circle, we spoke at the beginning about my grandmother and, how watching her going through the aging process and struggling with that. There were also many things where she said, I want a human for this, right? And like, for example, we're really short of people who can be caregivers, right? Like, and having a human being someone who can check in, every day with an older adult and have like a meaningful conversation with them, or having caregivers who can take care of children, which will also then enable more like gender equality in the workforce and things like that. There are so many roles where we want like humans to be the center of them. And so hopefully by freeing up some workforce from the dangerous, very manual tasks, we can also like recenter, humans in the kind of jobs that should stay human, I think. So I'm really excited about that too.
Yeah, a lot of people scared of, the automation is going to be so terrible for us, but there's so many other ways we can involve humans in more enjoyable tasks, like you said, checking in on caregivers, human connection, helping reduce loneliness, also using our brains more. And so really excited about that too. What climate tech are you so excited about? Is it harvesting carbon away from, if you can't share, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, the things I'm most excited about, I can't share, so I probably shouldn't.
Okay, but so I can be optimistic.
Well, and I think one thing I'm optimistic about is I'm seeing several bets in several different areas that are all potentially promising. Like, yes, like drawing carbon out of the atmosphere directly is something that there are several promising adventures, not just inside but outside.
Right. Yeah.
Same for kind of electrifying the electricity or electrifying objects and like making the grid more sustainable. Similarly for kind of transport, like every different area, there's now so much attention going to that I feel there are lots of different groups innovating. So agriculture is another huge one, which is a big problem, but I'm seeing lots of progress on the tech front. I think the thing that's going to bottleneck it is going to be the political will. But yeah.
All right, well, we have lots of work still to do, lots of political, private sector collaborations, and looking forward to tackling it together. This was great, Kathryn. Loved having you. Learned so much from you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me. This was lovely.
And it's a wrap. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like what you hear, leave a review and share.